Shavua Tov. Today we're going to be learning Ketubot daf ayin dalid. In order to start today's daf, we have to go back and review, starting from the very, very bottom of ayin bet on the bet. But we started with a machloket, kidsha al tnai uknasastam. A man betrothed today, our main topic is going to be conditions. We're going to basically continue today's daf with a big continuation of that sugya. So we started with a machloket between Rav and Shmuel. Kidsha al tnai uknasastam. A man betroths a woman with a condition. We saw two possible conditions, either that she not have vows upon her or that she not have blemishes. Okay, the second, I'm a bet today, we'll be dealing with maybe possible differences between the blemishes and the vows. But Amud Aleph is all going to be dealing with this same debate. So came the Gemara and said that Rav and Shmuel have a debate about a case where he betroths her with this condition, but then when he marries her, and we're going to see later a case where he has relations with her without stipulating anything about the condition, not relating to it at all. Rav says that's a valid marriage, even if it turns out she has vows, and therefore tzricha himenu get. Okay, those are going to always go hand in hand. If it's a valid marriage, meaning, right, according to, well, we'll see why Abaye says this, but in a minute we'll get to Abaye. But basically the marriage is valid. Why? Because he didn't stipulate the condition at the time of the marriage, which basically means that since he's now going to have relations with her, according to Abaye, no way is he going to end up sleeping with her if he didn't check out whether the condition is valid or not. He must be basically saying, I don't care anymore about the condition. What do you mean? Everything was based on the first condition. The condition was upon condition. The condition was never met. Even if he has relations with her, see later a case where they say, even if she has a child, doesn't matter. It turns out the condition wasn't true. There was never a betrothal in the first place, which means there was never a marriage. Marriage is built on the betrothal. We saw on that machloket two different ways of understanding. Abaye was basically to say, do we hold ein adam oseh bilato bilatnut, or do we hold maybe he would, right? It's possible he would, and therefore Shmuel thinks that it still goes by that first original condition. And Rav says no. Basically, we're overriding the condition once he has relations with her. It's clear. He's basically saying, I'm marrying you at all costs. Doesn't matter what the condition. Then we have Raba. Raba, after trying one attempt, we then re-understood Raba and reinterpreted. We'll go with the second one right now. Said that the machloket is all about when you have isha achat ke'ein shtei nashim, meaning it wasn't the simple case that we just described as where they have a debate. They have a debate in a bit of a more complicated case where he betroths her with a condition. Then he divorces her before they even got married. Then he betroths her and marries her a second time without stipulating any sort of condition. And then the machloket is a totally different machloket. The question is, when he marries her the second time, does he just assume that, like Shmuel thinks, well, he didn't say the condition, but obviously he's remarrying the same woman. He obviously, or getting engaged, etc. He obviously meant upon the conditions that we set up the first time. And according to Rav, no. If he wanted conditions this time, this is a new marriage, then you should have said that. Obviously, he doesn't mean to marry her this time with that condition. Okay, so that's the debate according to Rabba. The main important thing for Rabba is that in a regular case, the one we've been discussing, which is kichal tnai and baal or married her stam, kinsas stam, he would think everyone agrees that she doesn't need a get. Everyone agrees in that case. Of course, he meant it based on the first condition, even Rav. That's Raba. So until now, it's a very simple structure. I'm saying this because it's going to get very unclear. Okay, usually the Gemara is pretty organized. I mean, I know sometimes it's complicated, but it's pretty organized and it's pretty clear where the sugya is going. We have, right, until now, the sugya is very, very clear, even if it's maybe complicated, but we have Abaye's reading of the debate, we have Rabba's reading of the debate, and then we have several questions on their readings. As soon as we finish with this last question of Raba that we ended in the middle, against Raba, that we ended in the middle of, it's going to get a little bit more tricky where the sugya is going. We're going to have a lot of different comments about this case, but it's not as organized in as organized a manner as it usually is. So, and I'll point out where we have some difficulties about trying to figure out where these come into play in terms of the flow of the sugya. So we're now in the middle of this. We've been quoting different Toseftas that seem to contradict. Abaye seems to bring them against Raba. Your interpretation, again, your main thing basically saying that in a typical case, everyone agrees. And we're going to bring all these sources that seem to say in a typical case, or something similar to this typical case, it seems like they disagree. So And in each case, we're going to have a case. So the last case we're up to is about a minor who gets betrothed when she's a minor, right? So we'll read it inside. Modim chachamim le-Rabbi Elazar, 5 lines from the bottom of Ayin Gimel Bet. Biktana shisia via v'nitkarsha. She was betrothed by her father, which is a oraita, right? A father can betroth a minor daughter on a Torah level. V'nitkarsha, she gets divorced from him, so the Gerushin is also by Torah level. V'hi toma b'chei ha'av. At this point, the father can't marry her off again because he already kind of had a messed up marriage. That he married her off, he'd lose his rights to marry her off a second time. V'echzira, the husband decides to remarry her. Now, at this point, since she's a minor still, the marriage is only on a rabbinic level. Below, what happens? And then he dies without children. She can't do yibum. Why? She was really divorced with him, and you're not allowed to marry the divorcee of your brother, so she can't do yibum on a Torah level. Because if they were legit married on a Torah level, they'd be able to do yibum, because that would override the grusha. But in this case, since the second marriage was only rabbinic, it doesn't override the doraita of you can't marry your divorced brother's wife, your brother's divorcee. But it's only if he divorced her when she was a minor and then married her when she was a minor, and that would mean the second marriage was only rabbinic. And this is the one important for our purposes, which is if he returned her when she was a gedolah, okay, that one's not important. That means the second marriage is doraita, that's clear. But what if he returned her when she was a minor and then she became of age before he died? So now we're going to see, there's a machloket. Now this is very similar to our situation because the whole question is right, in the case of Isha Achat, where it's Ke'en Isha Achat, when he marries her and consummates the marriage by having relations, is he basically doing it based on the original t'nai? Or is he saying, oh, now, right, I'm having this relations with you to basically override the previous kiddushin, and there was a t'nai then, but now I'm doing it without a condition. So here it's the same issue. According to Tanakama, it doesn't make a difference. I'm sorry, she is married to him on a Torah level now. Why is she married on a Torah level? Because when he married her, had relations with her once she became of age, he basically had the intent, today, this is going to be the consummation of our marriage on a Torah level. Okay? That's the first interpretation. And therefore, she can do Yibum also, because it was a Torah marriage at this point. Because at a certain point, she became a Gdolah, and they have relations, and that basically overrode the previous. That's like saying, Kidsha al T'nai, Knasa Stam, without a T'nai. He basically was, when he had relations with her, he was undoing the old Kiddushin, kind of doing a new Kiddushin, and saying, now I'm doing it without any condition, and therefore the marriage is valid. And that would be Rav, who says, Tzricha get. Mishum Rabbi Elazar amru chalitza v'lo mityabemet. She can't do Yibum. Why? Because, like Shmuel, she was already married to him on a rabbinic level. They had, the first time they had relations, that was l'shem kiddushin, and, or to consummate the marriage, basically. And after that, he didn't do there was no difference between any of the bilot after that, even when she became a gedolah. So they're not actually married by Torah law. Okay, so what do you see here? This is like a case of ta'ut isha achat, because it's a similar case where the question is the be'ilah, is it kind of overriding that kiddushin al t'nai or not? And there's a machloket. And according to Raba, in a simple case like this, even though it's not exactly a simple case, but simple case like this where it's only one marriage, it's not like the marriage was dissolved and we have a new marriage coming, they all agree that she doesn't need again, and the first kiddushin is valid. And that's not what they're saying here. We're saying here is no, one does say that the act of be'ilah after, when they have relations, it overrides, right? It's saying now it's l'shem kiddush. So, Rabba, what are you going to say to that? To which Rabba says, you're comparing two different things. These aren't the same thing. Hatam nami b'hakam miflaga. They're really arguing about the following, not what you thought they were arguing about. Mar savar adam yodea she'en kiddushay k'tana klum. According to option number one, it was a valid Torah marriage once they had this be'ilah later on. Why? Because every Joe Schmo knows that Kiddushay Ketana is nothing. And when he married her that time, he obviously knew that the betrothal was only rabbinic. So of course, on her 12th birthday, right, he's going to make sure after that he makes sure that the marriage is valid on a Torah level. And when he betroths her, when he has relations with her, he's basically saying, now I'm basically marrying you, okay? And now I'm making sure it's Torah law. And that's why it works. Umar Savar and Rabbi Elazar, who says, that's not what's going on here. And every act of relations from day one is all going to just be an act of relations between husband and wife. He's not any day saying, oh, this is the one that's going to be by Torah law. That's because it's a fascinating machloket. The machloket is based on, what do we assume people on the street know? Okay, so no, the average person doesn't necessarily know the Kiddushay Ketana aren't. No one's going to realize it how many people think about it, right? If you're in this situation, would you pay attention to the detail that, oh, the first time I was married, it was by Torah law, and the second time I'm married, it's only by rabbinic law? You won't necessarily know that. And therefore, Kaba'al, when he had relations with her, he was only having relations based on the first original Kiddushin. So every subsequent time he has relations, even once she becomes of age, it's no different than the first. It's all based on the first one, which was only rabbinic. And then it's a totally different machloket. It has nothing to do with our case. Okay, so that's the end of our last question on Raba. Now we're going to move on. So again, I want to just again be very clear about how clear the structure is and how unclear it's going to be going forward. It's very clear. Raba and Abaye debate what the machloket is between Rav and Shmuel. And again, the main thing is that in a classic case, a typical case, Kidsha al Tnai, and then married her stam, according to Abaye, there's machloket between them, right? Shmuel will say she doesn't need a get. It's based on the first Kiddush. And Rav will say she needs a get because Ein Adam Oseh Bilato Bilatznud. And according to Raba, in that case, they all agree that she doesn't need a get. Everyone agrees that it was done on the Kiddush and Rishonim. It's only when there's some new, a unique case, a different case where they got divorced and then remarried, and then is it based on the original Kiddush or not? That's a whole separate, that's a machlok. But everyone agrees that she wouldn't need a get. Now here comes this a complicated words, which are usually not so complicated. Itmar nami means it was also said. Also refers to what we don't know, okay? So it depends on the girsa that you have in the text. Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Acha bar Yaakov says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, HaMekadesh al Tnai u'Baal, if you betroth a woman and have relations with her, I'm reading now according to the first girsa. According to my version, it has these words in brackets, square brackets. That means they weren't in the printed text, but you should add them. Divrei hakol eina tzricha imenu get. If you read Divrei hakol eina tzricha imenu get, everyone agrees that in a classic case of Mekadesh al Tnai u'Baal, you wouldn't need a get. That's basically Raba. And then according to this reading, he's supporting Raba. Now, what's the problem? The problem is, or that the Gemara is bringing him to support Raba, not that he is. But the Gemara is saying, he also says the same thing that Raba said, about that everyone agrees she doesn't need a get in this simple case. Now, problem is that Rabbi Yochanan is second generation Amora, like first to second, end of the first, beginning of second. He's living in Israel. Rav and Shmuel are living in Babylonia at the same time. They're first generation Amoraim. It would be odd for Rabbi Yochanan, some people think, it would be odd for Rabbi Yochanan to be commenting on a machloket Rav and Shmuel, because they're similar generation to him. Yeah, he's a little bit after them, but basically same time period. And they were in Babylonia. He was in Israel. They don't often communicate with each other. And it would be strange that he would be quoting their Torah and saying they don't debate this issue. So some people take out the words divrei hakol and claim that all he's saying is mekadesh al tnai u'Baal ena tzricha imenu get, which is basically a support of Shmuel according to Abaye's interpretation, and that it's just saying he holds just like Shmuel held about that within Abaye, that Shmuel and Rav disagree about this case. He holds like Shmuel does. And then the Itmar Nami is referring back to Shmuel. Okay, either which way, the conclusion is the same, which is in this case, he holds you don't need a get. Okay, that basically, again, we're going to assume whatever he does later is still based on the condition he made, the stipulation he made when they got betrothed. So Who brought this Torah of Rabbi Yochanan? Rav Acha bar Yaakov. His nephew, the son of his sister, Rav Acha bar Rav Ika, they both had the same first name. His nephew says, wait a minute, this contradicts, okay? Just like we brought all these Toseftas before, I'm going to bring a Tosefta that contradicts what Rabbi Yochanan said here. And it's going to be a Tosefta with Rabbi Yochanan's explanation. And then we're going to say Rabbi Yochanan contradicts himself. Forget about a tannatic source. No. It's Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation of this Tosefta contradicts what Rabbi Yochanan said, according to what we just said. So let's read. Chalitza mut'et ksheran. You might remember this. We learned it in Yevamot. If you make a mistaken chalitza, it works. So now the question is, obviously, ezohi chalitza mut'et. What is this chalitza mut'et? Machloket Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Again, Rish Lakish is not relevant to our purposes because all we want to focus on is Rabbi Yochanan, but we're going to hear the machloket anyway. Amar Rish Lakish. Kosha omer lo chalotzla ubekachata konsa. They're trying to encourage him to do chalitza. He really wants to marry her. So they say to him, listen, again, you're taking someone who doesn't know so much. And you say to him, if you do chalitza with her, she'll be married to you. Which is obviously totally wrong, right? We all learn, those who learn Masechet Yevamot know. Or if you learn, Sefer Dvarim, you know that chalitza is the undoing of the connection between them. Anyway, they convince him, and he does this chalitza with the wrong impression. He thinks he's going to marry her. That works because in the end, he did chalitza. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, what are you talking about? I learned that whether he has intent and she doesn't, or she has intent to do it and he doesn't have intent. You need the intent of both of them to fulfill the mitzvah. If so, and in this case, he clearly didn't have intent. He had intent to marry her, not to do chalitza. So of course it can't possibly work. So therefore, again, all that wasn't relevant, germane to our discussion. Here comes the important part. What's a chalitza mut'et that works? And it's going to be a chalitza with a t'nai. And that's how it's going to compare to our case, which is also a t'nai. So remember, our case has a t'nai in the kiddushin. And then when he marries her, he doesn't specify anything in particular, right? So that's the case. Kadesh al-t'nai u'ba'al. Here he even uses the words not to marry her, but he has relations with her, right, in the context of consummating the marriage. And he does that without any particular condition. So now we're going to say that the chalitza is the exact same case, which is not exactly, but the same kind of structure. Kol she'omer lo chalotzla al menat she'titein li 200 zuz. You might remember this. It was pretty memorable. They say to him, they try to, what's the word? Bribe him into doing chalitza. And they say, do chalitza to this woman and she'll give you 200 zuz. And if you remember, we learned there, what does it mean, chalitza mut'et kshera? This is a valid chalitza, and she doesn't have to give him the money. Okay, it was just a way of encouraging him to do chalitza. Now, we didn't say this at the time, but what they're going to explain right now is, in the context of our sugi, you can understand it like this. It sounds like, since they did the, right, when they talked about chalitza, there was a condition, a stipulation added. But when he did the act of chalitza, he did an action of chalitza. He didn't say at the time of chalitza, I'm doing this and you're going to give me the money. So it must be that, yes, that got him moving in the beginning. But when he did the act of chalitza without stipulating the condition, that must be, he basically said, I don't really care about the 200 zuz anymore. I'm willing to do it even without, which is exactly parallel to kidshal t'nai and knasa stam. And then if you say there, the fact that he did the action and didn't mention the stipulation must mean that he didn't care about the stipulation. Well, then we know that because in the end they say she doesn't have to pay the money and it's a valid chalitza. So therefore, hachanami, you should say the same by us. He should have basically overridden his condition because he had relations with her without specifying. And that's exactly opposite of what Rabbi Yochanan said. What did Rabbi Yochanan say by us? We assume it's all going based on the first stipulation. And with the chalitza, we're not assuming. So why would you distinguish between the cases? It makes no sense. Seeming contradiction in Rabbi Yochanan. To which Amar Le, Rav Acha bar Yaakov, who quoted Rabbi Yochanan, supports Rabbi Yochanan by saying, resolves it in the following way. He says, Farber Rav, you student of Rabbi, you're a Talmud scholar. Shapir kam, right? Do you think what you're saying is valid? Okay, now on the one hand, he's somewhat showing him respect. Remember, he was also his nephew, but he's kind of mocking him and saying, what? You think you know what you're talking about? And now they're giving another different reason for this halacha, which also we didn't mention when we learned it in Yevamot. The reason why this chalitza condition doesn't work is because there's something inherently wrong with the condition he made. Why? Where do we learn laws of conditions? And this comes up all over the Shas whenever we talk about conditions often or many times. We're going to learn the basic laws of conditions, or learn stipulations, are learned from the T'nai of Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven. You might remember they wanted different land. They wanted land not in the land of Israel, on the other side of the Jordan. And they go to Moshe, and Moshe says, well, what, you're trying to get out of going to war? Right? And he basically makes them promise that if they go to war, they will get the land they want. And there's all sorts of things that we learn from Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven. So to which he says to him, the reason this T'nai in chalitza is not a valid T'nai and is overridden is because it wasn't a good T'nai to begin with. Okay, why is that? Since all conditions are learned out from there, it has to have the same criteria as those T'naim. Now, often we say one of the things, by the way, is if you go and if you don't go. Moshe doubles it. It's called T'nai kafu. That's not the one they bring up here. Theoretically, you could have. It's also not a T'nai kafu. It doesn't say, I'll do chalitza if you give me the money, and I won't do chalitza if you don't give me the money. Right? That would be a T'nai kafu. But they give a different one, which is a unique one. You don't really hear this quoted. T'na'a de'efshar lekiyume al yidei shaliach ki hatam have t'nai t'na'a. What makes the T'nai Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven a good T'nai? Because it's a T'nai that a shaliach can do instead of you. Which means, now who's the shaliach and what could they do instead? It's a good question. So most of the commentaries say it's Moshe and Yoshua. Now, Moshe was supposed to conquer the land and go in with that. Instead, he appointed Yoshua. So the conquering of the land is something that they could have done al yidei Yoshua, or leading the conquering. It's a little unclear. But because Yoshua ended up replacing Moshe in this job, it's a T'nai that you could do al yidei shaliach. And that's when the T'nai is going to be a good T'nai. But de lo efshar l'kiyumei al yidei shaliach ki hatam. But chalitza, you can't appoint someone else to do chalitza for you. So since you can't appoint someone to chalitza, probably because you can't appoint someone to do yibum. Because what's yibum? Yibum is relations. You can't have someone else fill in for you for that. So therefore, you can't have someone fill in for you for chalitza either. Therefore, ki hatam lo ave t'nai. Therefore, since you can't have someone do a shaliach, your T'nai is not really a T'nai. And that's why it's just not a valid T'nai. And that's why she doesn't have to give him the money. And yet the chalitza is valid. Tosefta asks an interesting question. Tosefta says the only things you really learn from T'nai Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven are things that are logical. And he says, so what's the logic here? I like that he asked because he basically says, what's the connection between doing something that can be done by a shaliach and being able to make a T'nai then? So his question is better than his answer. I'll tell you the answer they bring, the Yesh Lamar, in the 5th line or 6th line of Tosefta, and T'nai efshar l'kiyumei al yidei shaliach. He says, "Hainu tama deho'ilu ma'aseh kol kach biyado sheyachol l'kaymo al yidei shaliach svara u'shiyeh kamochem biyado l'shavuye beit t'na'a." Again, you might disagree with this, but I thought it was just interesting to bring his answer to this, which is he says, he at least attempts to make a connection between the two things. He says that if you can appoint a shaliach to do it, it means you have more power to do such an action because you can actually also give it up to somebody else, give it over to somebody else. Again, one can argue with that, but it shows a power of strength that you have the power to actually let someone else do this action. That means that you also have the power to add stipulations. And if you don't, then you don't. Again, like I said, the question is a better question, really asking what's the connection between the two things, the logical connection. So again, we try to come up with a connection. I'm not convinced by it, but it is an attempt to try to address that issue. Okay, so now we basically are almost done with this section of Rabbi Yochanan. What we did now, again, just to review, Rabbi Yochanan basically either said something that is the same as Raba, that they all agree that you don't need to get in the case, a regular case of kichal t'nai knasas stam, or he's basically saying like Shmuel according to Abaye, and he's basically just paskening and not relating to the machloket of Rab and Shmuel. He's just saying this is the law, and then that would more theoretically match Shmuel according to Abaye's interpretation, where they disagree. We brought a Tosefta with Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation of that Tosefta, which seemed to say that by chalitza, the T'nai would be overridden. And here we think that T'nai isn't overridden. How could that be? because chalitza is a totally separate thing, and that there's really not a t'nai in chalitza. Whereas in kiddushin, of course, you can do kiddushin by a shaliach. They often did it by a shaliach. Okay, we'll see a whole sugya. Ish mekadesh bo b'shlucho, isha mekadesh bo b'shlucha. Okay, it's the main sugya, one of the main sugyas of shlichut. Comes up in kiddushin, and it can for sure be done by a messenger. And that's why there is a distinction. To the which the Gemara asks, but wait a minute. Kiddushin you could do by a shaliach only in certain cases. You can be mekadesh in three ways. Bekesef, with money, that's what we do with a ring. Bishtar, with a document. Or bibi'ah, by having relations. L'shem kiddushin, right, for the intent of betrothal. Well, one of those things you can't do with a shaliach. Right? Bi'ah you can't do with a shaliach. So you're going to say, if you did it, kidsha bibi'ah, you did it through relations with a t'nai and then knasa stam, would you say then it's not a valid condition? Right? No, everyone knows it's a valid condition, and yet it can't be done by other people. So that seems to go against your theory. That's just because once kiddushin bekesef ubishtar, you can do it t'nai. Obviously, you can also do it t'nai in kiddushin bibiyah. Once, right, that we basically say they have the same rules, even though theoretically, right, one maybe wouldn't apply to on a theoretical plane. Now, so again, now we're still not in the realm of like, where's the sugya going? We still pretty much know we have Rabbi Yochanan, who one of two possibilities: either he's saying the same thing as Raba, or he's just saying the same thing as Shmuel according to Abaye. Now it gets a little bit more confusing because we basically just have these statements and it's not clear like who's arguing with who and where this lineup comes in. But anyway, we have a bunch of statements about rabbis who basically ruled in this area. So Amar of Ulla bar Abba, Amar Ulla, Amar Rabbi Elazar. Here we're going to get Rabbi Elazar. Who's Rabbi Elazar before we go on? If we compare to Rabbi Yochanan, and he's going to also have a divrei hakol, okay, which seems to be also relating to Rav and Shmuel. Rabbi Yochanan was one of the main talmidim of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Elazar was one of the main talmidim of Rabbi Yochanan. It's Rabbi Elazar ben Pidat. He's the one who's known, if you remember, when they said, why didn't you say it in the name of Rabbi Yochanan? And then they said, well, everybody knows that everything he quotes is in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, so he doesn't need to say it every time, just like Yoshua doesn't say every time Moshe. I learned this from Moshe. He doesn't quote Moshe because everybody knows he's quoting Moshe. So he's a real Talmid Mupak of Rabbi Yochanan. However, the important part for our purposes is, as opposed to Rabbi Yochanan, he actually grew up in Babylonia and learned with Rav and Shmuel first. So he says a divrei hakol here, and it's definitely more likely that his divrei hakol really is referring to Rav and Shmuel. And then he comes up with a whole different understanding, and we won't even fully understand his issue, and you'll see why in a minute. Hamikadesh b'mil, he brings three cases. Okay, the next guy is going to basically disagree with two of his cases, but he's going to say, I only agree with you in one case, in what you said. Hamikadesh b'milva uba'al, he betroths her with a loan, and then has relations with her. What does this mean? If she owes him money and he says, listen, instead of paying me the money that you owe me, I'm just going to betroth you with the loan. Okay, basically don't return me the loan, and with that money, you'll be betrothed. You can't do that. Why can't you do that? Because, you know, under the chuppah, they always say, did you buy this ring? Is it yours? Do you own it? Right? That money, it's true he's owed the money, but he doesn't own it. It's not in his possession. So we can't betroth her with something that's not his own. So therefore, if he did it and then Baal and then have relations with her, right? The question is again, are the relations basically coming to say, I know it didn't work the first time. This is the real thing. Okay. And right, that's going to be the question here. Al t'nayu Baal, same thing. This is our case. He did it al t'nai with a condition. And then he had relations with her. And then it turns out the condition wasn't true. So do we say the bi'ilah, right? Baal stam. You have relations with her without specifying the condition. Is it overridden or not? Similar question. Or again, a case where the kiddushin, all these cases where the kiddushin is invalid. But then there was a bi'ilah after, right? Do we say, Ein Adam oseh bi'ilah to bi'ilah tzniut, and he meant to basically betroth her properly with that, right? Or without the stipulation, or not? So he did it with money, but it wasn't worth the value of a pruta, which basically means an invalid marriage. And then he did the bi'ilah. So those three cases. Here comes his divrei hakol. Everybody agrees. Sricha hemenu get. This is total. If we assume divrei hakol means Rav and Shmuel, number one, he totally contradicts Raba, and he totally contradicts Abaye. Why? Because Raba said divrei hakol, she doesn't need a get, right? There's no way that's a valid marriage because the condition was never fulfilled. According to Abaye, it's a machloket Rab and Shmuel. Shmuel says you don't need a get. Rav says you need a get. And he comes and says, and then theoretically, again, it's not unclear because the Gemara doesn't set it up as if this is a third opinion, but it sounds like he's coming with a third opinion that everyone agrees tzrichayim and get. The problem with this approach is one simple thing, which is we started with saying there's a machloket Rav and Shmuel. And one says, right, Rav says tzrichayim and get. Shmuel says ain't tzrichayim and get. Rabba, who said they all agree in a particular case, she doesn't need to get, explained in what case they disagree. Rabbi Elazar doesn't explain that they disagree at all. So either he says the machloket you have is just not a machloket, or you have to figure out in what case would he say that Shmuel would think you don't need to get. Okay, that's a little bit of a question that I'm going to leave open. It's not so clear where to go with it. But it does seem like he's bringing a third approach. It's not like Raba and it's not like Abaye. Amar Rabbi Yosef or Abba, Amar Rabbi Menachem, Amar Rabbi Ami. Rabbi Ami now is going to be quoted as disagreeing with him and says, I'll give it to you with one of the cases. One of the cases I agree with you. If it's less than a pruta and then he has relations with her, clearly she needs a get. Why? Again, it goes to what do we assume people know and what do we assume they don't know? Everybody knows that less than a pruta is not going to be a valid kiddushin. And therefore, for sure, when he had the be'ilah later on, he meant to say this act of relations is l'shem kiddushin, to fix the one that I didn't do properly. Ava bahana, but the other one's ta'e. No, people will think, maybe, right, my original condition still stands. Yes, I'm doing a be'ilah with you, but maybe my original condition still stands. Or, and then again, if the condition isn't true, meaning she has nedarim on her, let's say she has vows, then they were never married in the first place. And also, mekadesh b'milveh. He didn't know that you can't do that. It seemed reasonable. You owe me money. With that money, you won't have to pay me back. That's fine. That's basically transferring money to you, even though I'm not doing it. It's on paper, but it's still transferring money to you. He thought that worked. Therefore, when he did his be'ilah, he didn't say, I'm doing this, to override the mistake I made. He didn't know it was a mistake. Okay. So therefore, he disagrees with Rabbi Elazar, specifically about our case. Amar Rav Kahana Mishmei de Ulla. What I wanted to point out here in the structures, we're just getting like on the topic and just kind of statements. It's not clear where do they fit in the whole scheme of things, but overall, we're basically getting different opinions about this machloket and what we're supposed to do. So Amar Rav Kahana Mishmei de Ulla Mekadesh al Tnayu Ba'al Tzricha Himenu Get. Okay, so he paskins basically in the name of Ulla, which is interesting because Ulla quoted Rabbi Elazar before saying they all agree that she needs a get, and that's in fact what he's going to say. That's tzricha himenu get, and zeh haya ma'aseh. There was a case where it actually happened. V'lo haya koch b'chachamim lehotzia b'lo get. Another very strange line. There wasn't power in the rabbis to let her go without a get, which almost sounds like you don't really need a get, but the rabbis felt like she was married and now we're going to let her not be married without a get. It sounds like the rabbis kind of said better off to give her a get, where it then becomes a little unclear. Did he mean by law or did he mean better to do this? But, again, because otherwise you're basically let this woman walk out of the marriage. It seems a little strange to people. And they say, la'afuke mehai tana, and this is against the following Tana, who's going to basically quote Shmuel, who's going to quote Rabbi Ishmael, but it's going to fit in with what we saw with Shmuel from the beginning, that Shmuel says, you don't need a get. Okay, basically, he says, you need a get. And this goes against what Rabbi Yehuda said, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Mishum Rabbi Ishmael. And we're kind of have a drasha that's going to basically say otherwise. V'hi lo nitpasa, which is by the Sota woman, where it says she was not raped, means she did it willingly. Then she's asura. Then she's going to be forbidden. Okay, one thing with the Sota is, this already, we learned it many times in Yevamot for sure, which is, and even in Ketubot, once she sleeps with some other man, she can't go back to her original husband. So that's when hilonit pasa, if she wasn't raped. But hanit pasa muteret, if she was raped, she'd be allowed. What does it have to do with anything? Well, now they say, the he comes to teach something new. We're going to have another woman who maybe wasn't raped, but still will be permitted to her husband. What would that be? Ezo. It's if she had a mistake in marriage. What's a betrothal? What's a mistake in betrothal? There was a condition in the betrothal and it was never fulfilled. Shafilu, Bina more kavak tefa, even if her son is on her shoulders. Interesting, they use the word mi'un. It's not mi'un, but what happens in mi'un? Remember, she just walks out of the marriage. So like here, she could just walk out of the marriage. So that disagrees with what Ulla had said. Because again, what did Ulla say? Ulla said, if you're Makadesh al-Tnai and Baal, and then it turns out she had these vows, the Kiddushin was never a valid Kiddushin. Ulla says, anyway, we need to have her do a get. Okay? Again, Ulla seems to be saying, and also Rabbi Elazar, who says everyone says you need a get, could be based on this assumption before that we said, Ein Adam oseh bilato bilatznut, that you would never sleep with a woman unless you knew you were fully going to be married, which means you must have basically said, I don't care about this condition anymore. To which we bring this dissenting opinion, which was quoted in the name of Shmuel, which makes sense because that's where we started, that Shmuel says she doesn't need a get in this case, because again, the Kiddushin was never a valid Kiddushin, because the condition was never fulfilled. It doesn't matter that they have relations in the interim. It doesn't even matter if she has a child. The point is, he made a stipulation that she not have nidarim. He finds out 5 years later, she had these vows on her. Marriage is off. She walks out. That's it. No get. So again, the content is pretty clear. It's just a little bit confusing how all this fits into one whole picture. We just keep getting different opinions. It's not organized in the way often sugyot are organized. Again, the beginning is super organized. Yesterday's stuff, which is Rav and Shmuel machloket, Abaye and Raba machloket, how to understand the machloket. That was super simple. Then we got a little complicated. Is Rabbi Yochanan relating back to that machloket and saying like Rabbi? Is he saying like Shmuel? Then we had Rabbi Elazar, who brings seemingly a third approach to the machloket without really talking about the machloket, only saying that they all agree, almost maybe saying there is no machloket. That was a little confusing. And then we have a bunch of different rabbis about how they pass them. Okay, does she need to get? Does she not need to get? Now we're moving on back to the Mishna, which talked about the content. Now we have a woman who he made a stipulation on betrothing you, so that knowing that you don't have vows, right, under the condition that you don't have vows, and it turned out she had vows, or under the condition that you don't have blemishes, and it turned out she had blemishes. Now, both these things theoretically could be rectified. Okay, maybe not all blemishes, but there are blemishes that could be fixed. So comes the Gemara and brings a braita, Tanu Rabbanan, Hacha etzel chacham v'hitira. What if she had vows, but she went to a chacham, that's a specialist who can undo vows? And right, it's very apropos, we're almost Erev Rosh Hashanah, we do Hatarat Nedarim. She goes to, right, we stand in front of 3 people and annul our vows. So she goes to a chacham and annuls her vows. So we say, mikudeshet. Well then, right now, at the time of the betrothal, he says, under the condition, I'm betrothing you under the condition that you don't have vows. She does have vows, but then later she undoes the vows. That works. But aval rofe v'ripauta. But if he said, under condition she had blemishes. Turns out she had blemishes, but then she goes to the doctor and she fixes the blemishes. That doesn't work. Eina mekudesh. She's not, because she had blemishes. So why is the difference? Ma ben chacham lerofe. Chacham oker et haneder miikaro, v'rofe eno merape ela mikanu lahaba. The nature of hatarat nedarim is very different from the nature of fixing someone who's sick. When you're sick and you go to the doctor and you get better, you can't undo the fact that you were sick. You were sick and you got healed. Okay, so you might not have the blemish now, but you had it after the betrothal because he betrothed you with the stipulation. You had the blemish at the time. You got rid of it later, but at the time you had it. So that means the Kiddushin was invalid. But if you undid your vows, when you undo them, you're basically saying it was as if I never made the vows, if the vow never existed. So that means the Kiddushin was actually valid, which would mean you'd be betrothed, which would mean you need to get if he wants to divorce you. So now they say, wait a minute, that all sounds very good, but the Hatanya, there's a braita that says the opposite of this braita. Not the opposite, but in terms of the chacham, it says the opposite. Etzel chacham v'itira, etzel rofeh v'ripeota, and a mekudeshet. In both cases, you're not betrothed. Both cases, the betrothal was invalid. It doesn't matter that your neder was undone from the beginning. It still was an invalid marriage, betrothal. So how do we rectify this contradiction? This is no contradiction. This is a difference of opinion. Okay, so one is Rabbi Meir, one is Rabbi Elazar. What's the difference between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Meir? First, we're going to see it inside, what their opinion is, and then we're going to see where they hold this. And tomorrow's Gemara will explain how we know that it's connected, but maybe we'll also explain it as we get to it, because it's hard to teach it without really explaining it. So, Ha Rabbi Meir da Amar, Adam rotze shetitbazeh ishto bebeiti. When you go to do Hatarat Nedarim, I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you ever took a real vow, when you do it in shul, everybody says Hatarat Nedarim, you do it in front of 3 people. And okay, so, you've undone your vow. Everyone says this basic general statement. But if you've ever undone an actual neder, like you made a promise and you want to undo it officially, you go to 3 people. And I can tell you this, I did it once with something. It's embarrassing. Like you have to go and say, I did this neder and I didn't mean it. And I didn't this, and anyway, sorry for another time what that was, but the point is, anything that's embarrassing to you is often embarrassing to your husband as well, or your spouse, as we said before. So if you basically have to undo your vow in front of the court, which is the way you're going to basically make sure that this marriage is valid, right? You're basically saying, again, what did we say? You undo the neder later. It's as if you never had a neder, which means that you're actually betrothed. But in order to do that, you have to go to the court and possibly humiliate yourself. The question is, do we think this is humiliating to the husband or not, if his wife has to go to court and undo her vows? So Rabbi Meir holds, now it's a little bit strange, the language. I'll translate it literally, but then I'll explain what it really means. Adam rotzeh shetitbazeh ishto bebeitin. A person wants his wife to be humiliated in the court. That's not what it means. What it means is he doesn't mind. He doesn't find it an embarrassment if she goes to do Hatarat Nedarim. What's the big deal? And Rabbi Elazar Damar, and this is why the way they worded it, Rabbi Meir's way, is just to basically say the opposite of what Rabbi Elazar says. If you read Rabbi Elazar first, it doesn't sound so crazy. Ein Adam rotzeh shetitbazeh ishto bebeitin. A person does not want his wife to humiliate herself, to go to the court, to have to undo her vow. So therefore, even if she undoes her vow later, and which retroactively did it from the beginning, that's not what he wants. It's already humiliating to him. It's what he was saying is, I don't want you to have nedarim on you, and I don't want you to have to go to court to undo them either. So therefore, the condition is not valid, because that wasn't part of what he was stipulating. But if, according to Rabbi Meir, he doesn't have a problem with her doing that, it's not embarrassing to him or humiliating, then it's fine. She'll undo her vows. They were undone retroactively. And that's the first brayta we saw, which is therefore the betrothal is actually a valid betrothal, because she really didn't have vows on her, because later she retroactively undid them. Where do we see this machloket? Maihi titnan hamotziat ishto mishum neder lo yachzir mishum shemra lo yachzir. There's 2 ways. Normally, you can divorce a wife and get remarried as long as she doesn't marry anyone in the interim, and as long as you're not a kohen. So if that's not the situation, and you want to return a wife that you divorced, then you're not allowed to, if the grounds for divorce was because she had vows on her, or the grounds for divorce was because you heard rumors that she slept around with somebody else. Why is this? One of 2 possibilities. One is we don't want men to be, what might happen? It might happen that the man heard these rumors or thought she made vows and thought they were true, or she did make vows and they were true, or thought there were rumors and it turns out the rumors were false. In the meantime, he gives her a divorce because of it. She goes, gets married to somebody else, and then he comes along and says, oh, I just found out that you undid your vows, and that means that retroactively, like, I never would have given you a get had I known that. Or I just found out the rumors weren't true, and it turns out the get I gave you was under false pretenses, and it's not really a get. And now he dissolves the get, which means that theoretically she was married to him the whole time, which means that now her kids are mamzerim. So the rabbis want to prevent that from happening. So they say, you can't remarry her, so that you don't start saying, you can't take her back at all. What it means is, so that you can't start canceling your get. Second option is to say they actually want to penalize the woman. That's penalizing the man, right? And think twice before you act on this. The other option is we're penalizing the woman because we want to make sure that she doesn't take vows unnecessarily or do things that would cause rumors to be spread, right? Rumors normally aren't spread in a vacuum. So to avoid that kind of behavior, we basically say, if he divorces you on those grounds, you'll never get remarried again. So now we have a 3-way machloket as to what case does this apply, what case doesn't apply. Rabbi Yehuda, which is not important for our purposes, because we're looking for Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar, says, it depends how public the neder was. If it was something that everyone knew about, then he can't remarry her. If it was something nobody knew about, or a lot of people didn't know, then he can return her. Why? Because he views this whole thing as a knas. And he's basically saying, if it's a less severe neder, it's fine, right? We're not going to penalize her for minor vows. Rabbi Meir, Kol neder shetzarich chakirat chacham lo yachzir. Now, what does this mean? Husband can annul his wife's vows, but what did we learn? Only in certain categories. In other categories, you need a chacham to do it. The husband can't do it. So in those cases, lo yachzir, because those are the cases that she theoretically could, it's exactly the cases we're worried about. She could go to a court, get it annulled, and then he'll say, oh, I didn't realize that, you could have gotten it annulled, or I didn't realize you annulled them, and now I never really meant to give you a get. But she'eino tzarich chakirat chacham, where he can undo it himself. If he really doesn't want it, he'll undo it himself. If he doesn't undo it himself, so there's nothing to talk about. So yachzir, in that case, he can remarry her because we're not worried about this scenario. Now, what's obvious is Rabbi Meir has no problem with the husband remarrying. The husband will want to remarry her even if she went to a chacham lahatir, because he doesn't mind if a woman goes lahatir, it's a chacham. And therefore, again, the concern is if she goes to annul the neder further down the road, he'll say, oh, and I know you would have done that. I never would have divorced you. The get was not a valid divorce. And now we're stuck with a mamzer problem. Also, she married some other guy. Rabbi Elazar omer, it doesn't matter whether it needs chakirat chacham, it doesn't matter, it doesn't. Either which way, he can't remarry her. And the Rabbi Elazar, the only reason, it's actually the reverse of what you said, Rabbi Meir. We're going to do both, but one because of the other. In other words, we don't allow this because of the other. You might say, if we allow this, you'll think the other. But what's the real problem? It's a case where it doesn't need a hatarat chacham. Why? If it needs hatarat chacham, it's dafka him. If he can annul it, then he can come argue later. Oh, I didn't realize I could have annulled your vow, and I annulled your vow. I would, you wouldn't have a vow. That's the concern. But not about her going to a chacham, because he'll be humiliated for her to go to a chacham. You never would have wanted that in the first place. So we'll never come and say, oh, had I known you could go to a chacham, he never would have allowed that. That would have humiliated him. So here we see the machlok of Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Meir is, do we think he'll humiliate or do we think he won't humiliate? And with that, we'll end here for today. We'll see this again tomorrow because the Gemara hasn't really explained this all yet. It was hard to teach without explaining it. We'll see it explained in the Gemara tomorrow. We'll see what's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and then what's the opinion of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar, what's the logic behind them. Okay, with that, we'll finish for today. Shavua tov to everyone.